Off you go, Orlando.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for coming along. Many more people than we'd expected, and some very distinguished recipe writers aboard, which was a bit of a shock to me personally, because we did address this as a session for the less confident or less experienced recipe writer, or people who just wanted to brush up on their skills. But it's lovely to see you, and if you know it all already, forgive us. Now, this session was Ruth's idea. We talked about this ages ago, and she came up with the name of it, The Nuts and Bolts of Recipe Writing. And I'm the nuts, and Ruth is the bolts. Now, our objective is we want to share what we consider the classical method of recipe devising, testing, and writing. But that being said, there's more than one way to do it. We have experts in the room, and you might well do it better than I do. I'm sure you don't do it better than Ruth does. We're not saying, look, this is the only way to do it. We're not saying we work harder or do it better than you do. We're not saying that recipe writing is in a state of terminal decline. From my point of view, I'm particularly aiming at anyone who feels, as I have felt in my life, that thing called imposter syndrome. I wasn't trained in home economics. I kind of fell into it, and I kind of learned by watching other people. And so I was never really sure whether I knew how to do it properly. Eventually, I have decided that I do know how to do it properly, which is why I'm daring to be in front of you now. But there are people who have a lot of training who were taught how to do it formally. So you might wish to click off now, or you might wish to continue an argument on the Facebook forum saying that I'm wrong about everything, which is absolutely fine, because there isn't any right or wrong. Now, I said that Ruth was the bolts and I'm the nuts. I'm going to talk about the practical bit, which is what really interests me, which is how I turn an idea in my head into a working recipe on paper. The kind of example I'm going to use throughout my little talk is about a book project, but the same goes for any project, only it would be in miniature. So if you're writing a feature with 5 recipes, or indeed if you're just writing a set of 3 recipes for your blog, it's the same, that it's going to be miniaturized. Prepare to be bombarded, because I've got over 100 points here to get through, but I'm going to do them really quickly. I've set a timer for 20 minutes. I'm going to mail out my notes afterwards. I mean, I'm sure you will want to write down every pearl that issues from my lips, but I will be issuing my note kind of in brief form afterwards. I'll be issuing my notes. So don't worry if something flies by really fast. The first thing I want to talk about, I've called broadly the craft of recipe writing. I regard recipe writing nowadays as a professional activity. Everyone in this session is a member of the Guild of Food Writers. You're therefore, by definition, not an amateur. Now, at one point, I think anyone could write a recipe, and a lot of the great recipes of yesteryear probably were amateurs who took up the pen and started to write a recipe and found they were quite good at it. The profession has changed quite a lot since then. There's an awful lot being written and a lot of different ways of writing recipes. It's a mature kind of industry, and we are in it not as amateurs, but as professionals. With that in mind, I regard it as a big responsibility writing recipes. When I was a magazine editor, I used to kind of scoff a little bit at the fashion editor, and I'd say, oh, all you do is tell people what clothes to put on, or the makeup editor, all you do is tell me what eyeshadow to put on, or what lamp to buy for your house. These food editors actually potentially waste people's time, money, and they enter their system with something second rate if you haven't done a good recipe. That's quite an important, significant relationship, I think. So it's a big responsibility writing recipes if you're going to do it properly, and if you're going to be regarded as a professional, this word that I keep coming back to. Now, that being said, I don't think recipe writing is brain surgery. Most of it is common sense and, dare I say it, boring, hard work. Organisation and hard work, which is the bit that I'm going to talk about, and then I'll hand over to Ruth, who was going to talk about lovely, fluffy things, I'm sure, like drifting around gardens and smelling fragrant herbs.
Well, very serious things.
I'm going to talk about the organisation and hard work that go into a recipe, whereas the creativity with food, the zhuzhing of gorgeous ingredients, the finesses of poetic turns of phrase are the icing of the cake. So I'm not talking about that. And what I'm talking about is the kind of graft of recipe writing. It's not very romantic. It's not playing about in the kitchen. When I went to live in France and opened a hotel in France, I had this vision of myself sitting in the sunshine, maybe picking a few flowers, maybe greeting a few guests. Boy, was I walloped by reality. I never once sat in that garden. I did pick flowers in a terrifying hurry to put in guests' rooms. And I greeted guests with a kind of Richter smile on my face because I knew that something was boiling over in the kitchen.
Orlando, I have to interrupt. Having stayed at your beautiful chambre d'hôte a couple of times, can I just tell the audience, you're quite right. All he did was cook. And it's fantastic food, I have to say. But there was a lot of work went on and very little frills.
So that's really what I'm talking about, the hard work. And now I'm sorry, I hope I'm not depressing anyone, but I think to do this properly, you do have to do it as a job and not as fun. So the first thing I'd say, well, actually, on the craft of recipe writing, I'd like you to bear in mind something that Liszt had written over his piano, which is think 10 times and play once. So I would invite you to think 10 times and cook once. I see you all writing that down. That's so exciting. Now, the first thing that I suggest you do when you have decided that you've got a job of writing, whether it's something you've decided to do or whether you've been commissioned to, is scope it out. Now, this is particularly apposite for me because I've just completed a manuscript for a book which is coming out this autumn. And the first thing I did, I'm glad to say, was scope it out, because if I hadn't scoped it out, I tell you, the manuscript would not have gone in time. I needed to do 65 recipes in about 3 months. I worked out that meant at least one recipe needed to be perfected in a day. If I'd been asked to write that in a month, I would have said yes, but it would have been a very poor book. I did write a book in a month, but that was a no-cook cookbook where I didn't actually have to cook anything. I think if you realistically divide up the number of recipes by the number of days, you can see that to write a book in a month isn't really fair, although I know that people have to do it. I started with a provisional recipe list which came out of my head, which was what I thought the contents of the book would be, the names of the dishes, or roughly what they were called. This got revised countless times, but there were 11 actual editions of it, which shows that when you're just working in your head with provisional recipes, it doesn't happen like that, as we all know once you get into the kitchen. When scoping out your project, in other words, allotting the time for it, I would build in a lot of extra time at the end for the editing and polishing, and that horrible bit where you send it off and you find that it breaks your computer. And I allowed, I think, 4 days for that, and I used all 4 days because I had to translate it all into a different format. I had to get it from Pages format, which I work on, to Microsoft Word format. And if anyone ever has to do that, which is it's terrible with 65 recipes because you have to do 130 operations. I found an app called Docster that did it for me. If you work on Scrivener, I know that Jenny Hamilton, a guild member, Jenny Hamilton, works on Scrivener. I've no idea how she gets that to a publisher. So just watch out for your format, and it can make a total nightmare at the end if you're not careful. Now, another thing that I did as I went along is I added up my receipts for the tax man, and that was really satisfying because I got to, well, it was horrifying in a way. I got to over £1,600 in receipts that I spent on testing. And my book is about cooking for 2. So imagine how much that would have been if I'd been cooking for 6 or 8 or something like that. But it is satisfying to add up your receipts. 2 other quick things about scoping the project. Don't leave all the puddings or the bakes, if possible, to one particular section of the testing, because you'll get yourself a bit sick. I did them all in about, they fell for some reason within 5 days, and I really was feeling very bad towards the end of it. It's horrible cooking when you don't feel very well. And the other thing which I did do, which is leave some easy recipes for the end, just to make life a bit easier, because you're very tired after 50 recipes, you want the 15 last ones to go through okay. So I had 15 that I knew were bankers and that I was very confident about and had published in different formats before. So that made it a more gracious and graceful experience than it would have been. So I've got my scope. That's the first thing I do. I've kind of got the project. I've kind of allocated time for it. I know what I'm doing. The next most important thing is for me to set my recipe style. Who is it for? I worked for a publisher, so I got them to send me their style guide. I disagreed with certain things in their style guide, not in a nasty way. I just suggested we did things different ways. But you need to decide whether you're writing for a less experienced cook or a more experienced cook, or as if you're working with a publisher, what they expect from you. If you haven't got a publisher telling you or giving you a guide, then you can decide it for yourself. You might want to look at different books. You might want to look at different publishers, how to. Of course, I'm going to say that BBC is hard to beat because you know, it's the centre of the market and they've been doing it for years. So I tend to use BBC Good Food style. One thing that I will say is excruciating, truly excruciating, having to go back over dozens of recipes, changing TSP to teaspoon, or how you measure fresh ginger, or whether you add salt and pepper at the end, or ingredients, or whether you mention water. So just decide it before.
Orlando, may I just jump in here? I totally agree with this. One of the things I did, took me a while to get my head around doing it, but right at the start, I had a style sheet for myself where I put down how I was going to write constantly throughout. So the tablespoon thing, whether it was the TBSP, you know, fully written out. I think it's really important because you'll find yourself changing halfway through, especially a book, and suddenly you realize that you're describing something in a different fashion. So I think to have your own style sheet is really important right at the outset.
And be consistent. It doesn't matter what you choose to do, but whatever you choose to do, be consistent with it. Oven instructions are a minefield. You've got 3 or possibly 4 different things with oven instructions. You've got your fan, you've got your electric, you've got your gas, you've got your American, if you're not careful. And you've got your degree symbol, you've got your F. It will fall into chaos if you're not careful. I made a decision at the very beginning of my book that I was not going to preheat the oven at all. Yes, I was not going to preheat the oven at all. So the book is entirely tested without a preheated oven. And I have a big chapter at the beginning about why not to preheat your oven. But even so, I have to make the oven instructions accurate the same way every time. As I say, there's no right or wrong way to do it. Delia writes her recipes in a completely different style from Nigella. Regular posed an interesting point on the Facebook forum, which was that she liked to encourage cooks to use their common sense and observe what was happening without spelling everything out. That's absolutely fine. You can actually tell the history of the world in a sentence if you wish to. For me, I prefer to spell things out, and I have a kind of idea in my head of what my recipe writing style is, which is that I would like to think it is orderly, but with a sense of humour. So that's my own kind of vision for myself of what I'm trying to do. And orderly means that I measure very accurately, I time very accurately. I also, for my Cooking for Two book, I had some rules, like there were going to be no leftovers, there were going to be no half-finished packs, and I certainly wasn't going to be halving an egg. So we're all set up here. Now we're going to start actual work on the recipe. We're going to dream up our recipe. And again, you'll note we haven't been into the kitchen yet. We haven't been anywhere near the kitchen. I'm still in fact, I'm not at my desk. I'm now roaming around my study where I have quite a few cookbooks and my computer to look online. So we've got the basic idea for my recipe. And I'm now going to work out how I'm going to cook it. And this is where books come in. So I went to Abe Books, you'll know Abe Books, and got every book on the subject of Cooking for Two that I could lay my hands on. I think we might have 1 or 2 of the writers of these books in the room today. As well as scouring my library, I've actually I've left behind 2 cooking libraries, so I don't have that many books. So I rely quite a lot on the internet. But I'm sure that you wouldn't, for a lot of food writers, that's the most interesting bit, looking through the books, seeing how other people have done that recipe. I also have, from my day-to-day cooking, hundreds and hundreds of cuttings, files, and all carefully filed, which I have accumulated from everyday cooking, which are recipes that I've approved of enough to keep rather than screw them up and throw them in the bin, which happens, I would say, in 8 out of 10 cases. I think I screw up the recipes and throw them away. So these are all good recipes to start with, and that's very helpful. So I've got some resources here. I think if someone is making a buttercream or a cake, I haven't done much baking for this book, you probably have your own standard recipe for a cake that you use. If not, find out what other people have done. There are millions and millions of recipes out there, but there are millions and millions waiting to be invented. But your version has in some way got to be worth writing. It's got to taste better or be different or quicker or easier or in some way personalized by you. Now, this is a debate that it's a separate debate which we should probably have at some point within the Guild about the use of existing recipes. Because in quite a few cases, particularly with dear old Nigel Slater and the American resource called Cooks Illustrated, which is a paid-for website, which I'm very fanatical about, American website, they've done the recipe already perfectly. So I can't really use that recipe. I could tweak one ingredient and say it's my recipe. I could change the wording absolutely fine and say it's my recipe, but that's not really very good, is it? So I was a bit annoyed when I found that Nigel had done something beautiful, which I didn't feel that I could use. And I think that it's a complicated area. And then of course we get onto the copyright problem. I was taught in magazine school very early on that if you change a couple of ingredients and you change a bit of wording of the method, the copyright is yours. That says maybe, I'm not really interested. I don't think that's really mine at all. I think you need to significantly make a recipe your own. Otherwise, you should be certainly asking the permission of the person who created it to use it. Or if you feel that you've done a lot of work on it, but you owe them the original inspiration, then a nice credit for where it came from is appropriate. I would also urge anyone who missed Malika Basu's talk about respecting the source of dishes and the origins and heritage of recipes. That was one of the most useful things that I've ever been to. And the moment I came away from that, I went through my book and went, ouch, ouch, eek, eek, what am I saying here? Because I found that I inadvertently, of course, been disrespectful towards different cuisines and and used wordings which I understood are not the best wordings to use. Now, I'm quite paper-based, and there are my files. And so having decided what I'm going to cook and looked through my sources, I start to type it out. Now, I'm going to take as an example here one of my recipes, if I can find it in this pile of stuff. I decided that I was going to do a macaroni cheese souffle. Now, I'm sure this has been done, but in my head, it was the original idea. I make a lovely macaroni cheese. I use Felicity Cloak's cheese souffle recipe. I thought that would be a lovely supper for my store cover chapter. My first step, which I'm coming to now, is my first draft. So I pulled together my macaroni cheese recipe from my head. I looked up Felicity's from my file of recipes that work here. And I typed out version number 1, which it looks like something like that. And a kind of theoretical version of how it would work out, trying to reduce in quantities, just collapsing these 2 dishes down to see how they'd work. Now, I apologize for all the paper I use. This is all my testing archive for this book. It's hundreds of pieces of paper, and my printer won't do 2-sided, so I can't even use 2-sided. The 2-sided isn't great in the kitchen. But I do. It means I can track changes. So I will bring this first draft into the kitchen and sit it in front of me. And this is the first time that I've actually cooked, been near the stove. And this is my first test. Of course, before the first test can begin, you've got to do your shopping. In most cases, I bought double what I needed because I would expect a retest. we'll come to retesting and retesting and retesting in a moment. Now, this is my kind of laboratory phrase. We have in the room Angela Nilsson, who I learned so much from at BBC Good Food, and we used to call her the professor because she was very much, she was all stopwatches and thermometers, and she wasn't in a lab coat or anything like that, but she was highly scientific in her approach. And so a lot of what I learned about diligence was to do with her. So I have a fantastic timer that can time, multi-time, and really important, time from the beginning onwards. So I've got this, it will ring after 20 minutes, but more important, it will tell me how many minutes have elapsed, because say it takes 37 minutes, I want to know that it took 37 minutes. So I cannot recommend a complicated selection of timers enough. I also use a cooking thermometer the whole time. Ruth?
Yes, sorry, I just want to dive in on that point. I know Sam's going to mention the Twitter feed that she asked a question about what drives people mad about recipes, but one of the things that drives me completely potty, and it happens a lot more, I think, in newspapers than it happens in books, is when the writer says preparation time 20 minutes. And I look at the list of ingredients, I look at the cutting, I look at the prep, I look at everything else, and I think, in your bloody dreams, if you had a whole kitchen brigade, it might take 20 minutes. That is going to take me at least 45. So I think your idea of having your timer going right from the get-go, so you're not going to inadvertently or deliberately lie to the reader, is a really good idea.
Thank you, Ruth. I mean, I think I'm going to talk about honesty a bit later, but it all comes down to honesty, really. So I measure everything with a stupid tape measure from IKEA. I take everything's temperature. It gives me a chance. Obviously, I'm weighing everything. My oven, just a quick note on ovens. My oven seems absolutely fine because when I cook published recipes, I tally with their timings. I have to turn everything round. I have to rotate it, but I've never had an oven where you haven't got to rotate it. So I think we have to live with that nuisance. So if you find your oven isn't matching the general published work of ovens, then people talk about oven timers. I don't really find they work, but I'm lucky that my oven seems to be consistent with what is out there. So that's great. So having got my recipe together, I'm making it for the first time. As you can, I don't know whether you can see, but I'm writing all over it. I'm scribbling over it rather messily, as well as getting food all over it. I mean, there's an awful lot going on here because this is the first draft of a totally new recipe. But as more than writing all over it about the things that are too thick or too thin or aren't cooked or are overcooked or you have to just ask yourself, does it taste great? Could it taste better? The flavor, the texture, the balance, the impact. Is it worth the effort? That heartbreaking thing of it, okay, it works, but I wouldn't make it again. If this was a published recipe, how many stars would you give it? How does it look? Does it need some more color? How would you serve it? Would a food stylist throw him or herself under a bus at the sight of this brown beige horror? Is it the correct amount for 2 or 4, or is it actually for 3? So you've either got to throw half of it away, or 4 people haven't got enough. This is also your chance to really shine with the reader by streamlining the process, not leaving them with half packets. If you're using a teaspoon to measure, use it on the dry ingredients first, so you haven't got to dry it, get the oil off it before measuring the cinnamon or whatever. And think of people's washing up, try and help people. And I put down here exactly what Ruth said, timings, be honest. Honesty, what it all comes down to.
Also, may I just say about that thing about doing things in the right order? If you're using a Magimix or food processor or whatever, look through, and despite what the recipe says, if the dried breadcrumbs can be done before the custard or whatever, then do it that way around so you don't create huge amount of washing up for yourself or your reader.
These are the ways that we get into the hearts of our readers, because remember, they're there cooking with us, and they're really with us. They're really with us in the kitchen. So as Ruth says, if you can save them some trouble or give them an easier time, they will understand that and they'll like you for it. That's why people like Delia, for instance. So anyway, having labored through this recipe and made this nightmare of a macaroni cheese souffle, which was pretty catastrophic, I go back to the computer, I take it in my corrections. This is the second draft stage. At this point, I decide, what am I going to call it? So macaroni and cheese, mac and cheese souffle, macaroni and cheese souffle, possibly can't be too exciting with that. I know a well-known, famous food writer who called a dish well-buggered lamb. I can't think who that is, Ruth Watson.
No, can I?
There's a habit at the moment of listing the ingredients in things. I've seen this quite a lot in magazines, actually. So you end up with, by the way, this is fictional, cauliflower soup with cider, chèvre, mustard, caraway, and chili oil. I'm kind of falling off my chair here with boredom. Also, that's too many flavors in one thing. But there's a sort of tendency just to pile in an extra flavor, and perhaps you think you've got a new recipe, and it ain't as simple as that.
And can I just, in that sense, looking at restaurant menus, the same thing. I spend my life, because I love writing menus, but saying to other people, this isn't a recipe, it's a dish. You highlight the main ingredients. You certainly highlight something that people might hate, like ginger or anchovy, because you want to immediately tell them that's in it, or you don't, depending on whether you know that actually they're not going to be able to taste it. But I think it's really important that you just give that real sense of what you're going to be eating, but not give the whole recipe in the title.
Yeah. The recipe titles are really important, and my editor for this book said to me before I did it, I always change the recipe titles. I don't think she has changed many, but I work very hard on them. They're not in any sense automated. The introduction, as Ruth just mentioned, is another really important thing. I see the introduction as a reason for the reader to make it. That's its main purpose. Secondary, we used to say at the magazine, as Angela will remember, but I probably drove her nuts. I wanted always to put in the recipe and introduction an announcement that you could make to your guests or family about the thing. For instance, this dish was a favourite among pirates in Minorca in the 18th century, or some contextual thing, or some fun thing about it. If there is a fun thing to say, if there isn't, don't make it up. There's one thing that I really, really hate, which is what I call overselling. I remember falling out with a cookery editor long before the happy days of good food, who wrote, "The secret of a happy Christmas is a well-stocked freezer." Please, please, where is your humanity? What about, you know, the joy of having people with you, the joy of having a warm home, the joy of having enough to eat, the joy, It's a well-stocked freezer. I could have actually wept. I was so upset by that. But at a more simple level, some of our best known writers say, I make this practically every Sunday about a roast. Or sometimes I serve this with da-da-da, but it's also lovely with da-da-da and da-da-da-da and da-da-da. I mean, how many meals can a food writer eat? It's simply not true. And if you say, I make this practically every Sunday, well, this is a very peculiar lifestyle this food writer has, because I don't know about you, I'm constantly trying new recipes. I very rarely go back to a recipe twice, because I'm always trying something new. While we're talking about the second draft, I have on my computer screen a virtual notepad where I list any tips that I'm putting into recipes as I go along, and also any information that I wish to include in the introduction. I've got over 50 tips in my current book, so it'd be really easy to repeat them. And when I submitted the manuscript for Table in the Tarn, which was my French book, I realised that after it had gone in that I actually told the reader how I liked parsley chopped 4 times. So just keep tabs on things, because going back through the whole thing again and again is a nightmare. Now, having got my second draft ready, obviously I have to take the macaroni cheese souffle and I have to test it again. And I had to test that, I think, 4 times in total. And at that point, yippee, I'd taken a simple reference shot. I think publishers are very grateful for that reference shot. So it doesn't need to be anything fancy, just an overhead shot. And so one is kind of there. If you accept, you have to repeat until the recipe is right. So I'm feeling quite good about these recipes. With some of them, I'm afraid I've got a depressing file of write-offs. One of them was my attempt with zabaione for 2, which you can do it, but Oh, it was so depressing. I tried it every which way. I did grilling it, It was just awful. I wasted an awful lot of eggs with that. But it's a bit heartbreaking. And then there was a belly of pork thing that I tried and tried with it. And eventually the time comes when you have to stop. I don't think I'd go above 5 attempts with anything. There's a very complicated, what my editor calls the kind of wedding dress moment of the fashion show, which is a birthday cake which I made, which is in the spiral formation, and I got the idea of this from Felicity Cloak's workshop on how to where recipe ideas came from, and it was an Ottolenghi idea that her presenter Helen Go had come up with, where you make a long thin, you make a cake, you cut it into long strips, and then you wind it up. And I wanted a very small birthday cake, and that's what I did, and that was a lot of attempts, but I got there in the end. To my horror, this morning I happened to have the television on, and they were doing something terribly similar on Junior Bake Off, which I was rather upset about. Here am I thinking it's the most original thing ever done since the history of man, but there you go. So they're doing it on Junior Bake Off as well. Sometimes you strike a problem. That I did a posset, which is an old favourite, again from BBC Good Food Days, where you boil the cream, and I became aware that I remembered that American cream is different, and we're doing an American co-edition, so I had to do that all over again. I realised I had to do that again with cream, with whipping cream instead, because it boils at a different pace. Just a couple of other points about the testing process. I have a friend down the road called Amy, who will always try a recipe for me if I've got as far as I can with it and I think it's okay, but I'm a bit worried about it. She'll always, I pay for her ingredients and she does it. She'll also take excess food and ingredients off my hand, which is marvelous. When I wrote a daily recipe column, I had something more formal organized. My mother did all my testing. Well, I tested it and then my mother did the retest for it. I think Delia has someone who actually tests a member of the public who tests her for it, but that's a large outlay that we can't really afford, having spent £1,600 already on the testing. I also had my partner, who's a writer, read my introductions and the introduction to the book. I don't make him read the recipes, because I think that's prose and it's nice if it flows well and is literate. A couple of final things. Once the book is out there, do encourage feedback and comments from your readers. Don't be frightened of them. You can learn so much. When I go to the BBC Good Food website, which is one of the greatest resources, I always look at the comments. Some of them make you howl, of course, but it's interesting to see what they're saying. You often get a kind of consensus there. If you have a book of your own that you come, this is my old table in the tarn, very, very tatty, and you continue to make the recipes, annotate them with your corrections. Now, dear old Robert Carrier, in times of yore, showed me his marked up copy of Great Dishes of the World, which was his great classic masterwork. His book got so marked up that he actually did new Great Dishes of the World on the strength of his new and improved recipes. He got a whole book out of it. So I have 3 final messages for you. First, which are kind of recap in a sense. And by the way, as well as my notes, I've done you an amazing flow chart of how this all works. A flow chart, me and a flow chart. That's how much I care about you. So the final 3 things, which I have already said, as members of the Guild of Food Writers, we should approach recipe writing and testing in a professional, business-like way. It's how we distinguish ourselves from all the many amateurs out there. That's lovely, but they're amateurs, we're professionals. By the way, if you get blocked or you're worried about your recipe writing, that's what our mentorship scheme is for. Just a plug for the mentorship scheme. Second thing, which Ruth brought up.
Please, Orlando, can I just dive in there? Because that point and one you made earlier, I think it's really important. It's very difficult to know when to say stop. This does not work. This is not good. And it's not just about the food and whether it tastes good or whether you can make it and whether it doesn't really work or any of that, but it's also about writing. I think it's really important to know that when you're struggling about how to express something, I learned a system where I would park that difficult thing. I didn't throw it away completely. I'd park it somewhere else. And then I would sit there, and it sounds so simplistic, but it's exactly the same for the actual food as it is for the writing, is what do I want to say? And then you start off and suddenly it all flows. And I think the same with the recipe. If you keep struggling and it still isn't working, dump it and start again.
Exactly. Another technique, Ruth, which is really useful, is to actually, if you're getting in a terrible tangle explaining how to make this wretched spiral cake, try verbalizing it, try explaining it in actual words, and you use a different part of the brain, I believe. And so if you actually say it, it comes out what you mean without the struggle of writing.
Exactly right.
So my second of 3 messages is, which Ruth chimed in with, be honest with yourself and the reader. Does it taste as good as it can? Are the instructions, timings, descriptions accurate and true? And if they're not, then really it's not fair to you or your reader. And the third thing I want to say is, do forgive my slightly industrial attitude to this part of the cooking process. I do know how creative the job that we do is. I love it. I absolutely adore it. And I adore writing recipes. But I am personally scandalized when I take a recipe, as so often happens, and it doesn't goddamn work. So it can be written as rhyming couplets, it can be a sonnet for all I care, but if the recipe doesn't work, the writer hasn't done their job. So with that, I hope that we will continue this discussion on the Facebook forum, by the way, but I would now like to hand over to Ruth, who is much more poetic than I am, and will enrich and gild your lives with actually something more, less workaday than my part.
Well, I'm not sure that that's true, actually. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. We really appreciate it, and we're very touched, Orlando and I. Some of the things Orlando said that I just want to repeat because it was my introduction. This is one of the problems with the joint workshop, and we deliberately didn't want to read each other's notes because we wanted to be, fresh about it. But I think the thing about making sure that you know who your audience is really, really important. Not just whether they're professional cooks or amateurs or something like that, but also the kind of tone of your recipe and who it's directed at. If you're writing for, say, delicious, it's going to be different from writing for men's health. It's not that men's health that men don't bake, they do, but there's a real thrust there towards healthy eating and bodybuilding and all that sort of stuff, which probably won't sit quite so well with the delicious audience. I mean, as a real simple example, Delia writes for families, apart from One is Fun, which is her least well-selling book as far as I can remember. So she writes for family, and Nigel writes for solo couples, millennials, and people like that. So I think it's really important to really ascertain who it is you're trying to talk to. I also agree with what Orlando mentioned, and I'm sorry if my eye feels a bit, I'm having real troubles with my sinuses in my eyes at the moment. So if I blink too much or look a bit weird, that's why. I do apologize. I think it's really also important to write for yourself as well as for your reader. I found it very important to make jokes because writing is such a solitary experience, and you literally are locked away for, as you know, days and days and days and months even. And I found myself sometimes telling a joke or writing a joke or saying something silly just to amuse myself. And I thought, well, perhaps it will amuse the reader, I hope so. But I think if you're not happy with what you're writing yourself, why would the reader be happy with it? I mean, it stands to reason. It's a bit like giving presents. If you don't think it's wonderful, why would the person you're giving it to think it's wonderful? So I think it's really important to establish that. I think when we talk about the introductions to recipes, it's very interesting that going back to Sam and her little questionnaire about what do people hate about recipe writing, one person said they didn't want your life story. Well, yes, I agree with that. And actually, I find it really tedious when people go on about what granny cooked them when they were 8 years old. But equally, I do think it's important to mention the provenance of the restaurant, why it's there, what have you put it in there for? Who is it meant to be directed at? So when you're glancing through, I mean, I like, for example, Diana Henry often says that this is her favorite or her family's favorite. And I take kind of consolation from that and reassurance that actually I'm going to like it as well. So I'll try it rather than a recipe that has nothing about why it's there. Again, Orlando's mentioned it, but it's really, really important to recognize, acknowledge, and thank a source that you have taken from. So whether it's overtly the person's name that you were reading in the book and they said this and you've tinkered around with it and you think it's different but just as good, whether it's about where it comes from in the world and what you've done with it. You know, it came from Sri Lanka, but unfortunately I can't get candleberries or whatever here. And what is it called? Candleberries? What is the word?
I don't know, I'm afraid.
Anyway, something again, candle something that our audience will know. But I substituted this, but it's really, really important. I think it's just polite, you know, apart from anything else. Hugh Whittingstall once stole a complete recipe from us at the Fox and Goose, word for word, printed it. And I did actually phone him and say, Hugh, that's exactly our recipe that we kind of gave you. And he had forgotten. I mean, he wasn't being horrible, he'd forgotten, and he apologized profusely and made amends in future editions. But there is a fine line between how much you've done to it and whether it becomes yours or whether you've appropriated it. And I think, again, as Orlando has said, just be honest about it. Far better to credit somebody with something that perhaps you've done more work to than they did, than not credit them at all, because you don't want feedback that says you're a horrible thief. Why would you? And again, as I said, if it's a classic recipe, and this can be British, can be, you know, from China, I don't care where it comes from. If you're going to make significant alterations, then you must say so. So, for example, there's a book recently published, Vegan, with a sprout nasi goreng. I hate sprouts, but that's not the point. And yes, nasi goreng is one of those recipes that is basically fried rice with a whole stack of additions. But I would have liked to have known in her introduction that it nearly always has an egg on top. And this one obviously didn't because it was vegan. But I think it would have been nice to know that, because sometimes when you're reading a vegetarian book or a vegan book, you know that you're actually going to add some meat, eggs, fish, cheese, whatever. And in that instance, I think that not only does it give credit to where the recipe comes from and what it authentically would be like, but also it's giving people the opportunity to think, oh yeah, I really fancy an egg on that. That will make a more substantial meal, perhaps for your husband who might adore eggs and you might be a vegan. I don't know. So the other thing is, what kind of event and or audience will it suit best? So one of the reasons that I wrote something for the weekend, which was for 8 people or more, was because I got fed up with people phoning me up and saying, can I double up on this recipe and what have you? It's rather like Orlando's written for 2, the same thing. You know, there's a lot of recipes out there for 4 to 6, so they don't always work for a couple. And that's why I imagine he's written that book. But for example, don't do fish and chips and then suggest that 8 people are going to come round to eat it, because even a fish and chip shop struggles to do a portion of 8 fish at one time, never mind the chips. And you with your little, you know, whether it's set in or a little electric one, you're not going to be able to cope with it. Sorry to segue a bit here, but I was invited last year when we had the interim from lockdown, when we were allowed to get together, to a lunch party with 14 people. And I was a bit staggered when I got there that how little had been prepped. And I thought, oh, are we going to be eating at 3 or 4 o'clock? Then it turned out that she was borrowing the next door building's cooker. The Ray-Ban that she had in her kitchen wasn't actually lit. And she came back in tears because those people had said, no, we're having our lunch. You can't use our cooker. And it turned out she had intended to make cod, fresh cod, for 14 people. Now, again, any restaurant would be hard pressed to do fresh cod for 14 people, pan fried, you know. So, as I said, when you're starting to write it, let people know what it's for, who it's for, when it's for, whether it will work with this or not work with this, don't send them down a blind alley and have them all miserable because, you know, it's a complete, I can't use the word something up because Orlando is listening, because it will be, and they won't like you for it. The other thing about the introduction, it's a real opportunity to engage with your reader, for them to find out about your style, what you think about things, and they might hate it, which is fine, then they put the book back on the shelf. But it's also, I think, very interesting. Jane Grigson took a very academic line, a lot of social history, culture, etc. Excuse me, I'm just going to mute myself while I cough. Hold on one second. Whereas Elizabeth David was very evocative of time and place, and you know, really brought things to life in a marvelous, picaresque way. But actually, I think her recipe writing leaves a lot to be desired. I know Orlando agrees with me. So, you know, whether you want to be chatty, comforting, inspirational, whatever, be something. You know, don't just be boring and bland, because again, there's a lot of that around. You don't need to add to the list.
I completely agree with you, Ruth. I think that it's not enough just to make a beautiful dish that tastes wonderful. It's making sure that it is served in the right context that will make it beautiful, because a lovely dessert for 4 is actually horrible for 2 people, because you waste half of it, or you put it in the fridge for next time. And if I can return to something that you said a bit earlier about the kind of joy of cooking, that you want to put some joy into your recipes. I made a conscious decision at the start of my book to have some kind of joke or pleasantry in every recipe. So it's either in the method, you might want to hunt it when you all buy the book, it's either in the method or it's in the introduction, it's a good tip. But there's some kind of, if not a gag, there's something light there, or something just, which I hope will make you smile.
Yeah, I mean, you don't want it to be a manual, you know, although it is a manual in the sense that it's got to work and everything's got to be proper and properly timed and everything else, but it doesn't want to feel like a textbook. How much knowledge the reader has, so tricky to get right, because it does dictate the detail needed and the length of the recipe, and in fact the entire book. And Mastering the Art of French Cookery, which a lot of people don't realize wasn't just Julia Child, but Louise Bertol and Simon Beck as well. I mean, it goes into such enormous detail, with each stage painfully described. Example, to check if a chicken is almost done, I'm going to read here. This is what she writes. Indications are a sudden rain of splatters in the oven, which I love, by the way, a swelling of the breast and slight puff of the skin. I like that too. The drumstick is tender when pressed and can be moved in its socket. To check further, press the thickest part of the drumstick with a fork. Its juices should run clear yellow. As a final check, lift the chicken and drain the juices from its vent. If the last drops are clear yellow, the chicken is definitely done. If not, roast another 5 minutes and test again. I'm asleep by the time I've got halfway through that, even though I like the language. I mean, that is so overkill to see, you know, I mean, most people would say, take the thickest part of the chicken, shove your skewer or whatever in there. If the juices run clear, yellow, you know, it's fine. I mean, it might be okay for a complete amateur, but I would find that very off-putting. So compare and contrast with Nigel, who says his recipe, lovely title, a chicken lunch for a searingly hot summer's day. This is why he's so brilliant. Because, you know, notice the title immediately gives you a sense of time and place and where and how. And I mean, it's just lovely. So his instructions are simply roast a chicken, perhaps with olive oil and lemon, and set it aside to cool. And no, there isn't a handy appendix giving the reader any more basic detail. He's assuming that you know how to cook a chicken, which probably most of his readers by now do. My own feeling is that unless you're an established author with a recognizable style, then the title and the general introduction should make it plain whether you're providing meticulous detail or the recipes are more ad hoc. My own really helpful cookbook was criticized for not being as encyclopedic as the title suggested. And I understand that totally. I'm not going to refute or rebut. But actually what I was trying to say was the recipes were foolproof, not that it included, it wasn't, you know, Delia's complete cookery course, but I think it was my least successful title. Well, it did so well. So when is it okay to be casual about measurements and quantities, and when is it not? So I'm now going to tell you a bit of gossip. On Sainsbury's magazine, I cannot tell you the fights we had with Delia about her tablespoons.
Oh,
And actually, I'm really surprised that everyone always thought, you know, if nothing else, Delia's recipes were foolproof. I don't think her Yorkshire pudding is foolproof at all. And one of the reasons is that a standard tablespoon, as you'll all know, is 15 mils. Delia's old-fashioned tablespoon, it was her mum's, a beautiful spoon, contained 25 mil. Now, you think about 2 tablespoons and you're looking at the difference, 50 mil and 30 mil. That can be hugely important in some recipes, not in others. And we kept saying, look, we have to give the readers a standard measurement. We won in the end, but it wasn't easy. I tell you, it wasn't easy. Nigel Slater says in Real Food, I find it easier for a cook, particularly an inexperienced one, to start with an exact weight of the main ingredient, e.g. 2 pork chops, about 350 grams each. Then the recipe loosens up a little, allowing cooks to use their instinct and taste buds rather than blindly follow a recipe as if it was carved in stone. Now, going back to what Regular was saying, I think this is really tricky because my gut feeling is more people can't cook than people can cook. We know from the plethora of TV programs that people still buy so many ready meals, so much stuff, although they've been educated for what, 10, 15, 20 years on television with endless programs showing you how to cook. But my feeling is that most people still really can't cook. And I think that it's really, I would prefer to spell things out, not in the Julia Child way, I think that's over the top, but I think people need a bit more guidance than just putting in a bunch of something or whatever. I think they need to know, is your bunch a huge, great Valentine's bouquet, or is it a tiny little posy for a bridesmaid, you know, aged 3 years old? There's a big difference. And I think one needs to be quite clear about it. He does go on to say, though, that where measurements are crucial, then I tell you, but he says, do you know anyone who actually weighs the spinach for a salad? Well, yes, I do. Delia does. In her madly successful complete cookery course, her recipe for spinach and watercress salad calls for 8 ounces of young spinach leaves. Yes, Nigel does say it's a bit like counting the bubbles in a chocolate mousse, which was a marvellous line. Excuse me again. It's their style, and they're very, very successful, both of them, because they are writing for their individual audiences. So Nigel has it in a nutshell. Sometimes it's important, sometimes it's not. And obviously, if you're baking a cake or a tart, it's really, really important. I mean, one thing that drives me as an experienced cook really mad is when people don't tell you what size approximately a dish or a bowl is. So if you're making an aubergine parmigiana, for example, I want to know whether I'm looking at a dish this big or a dish this big, because otherwise I'm going to have either 1 layer or 6 layers. And you know, you need to know these things, baklava, those kind of things. So I think that's very, very important. Saucepan size is also very, very important. People don't realize, I know when I made the minestrone recipe in whatever book it was, I mean, I make it in, I don't even know how many liters, but the saucepan is like that. It's huge. It's a weekly soup, which we, you know, tuck into every so often throughout the week in the winter. People don't realize that when they're cooking pasta, you need an enormous amount of boiling water. And when people get rice and pasta wrong, it's nearly always, I think, not the timing, it's because the pan is too small and there's not enough water for the pasta or the rice or whatever to, you know, kick around and do its thing. So I think those kind of things are really important to get right. When it comes to spices and herbs and other flavorings, if it's parsley, honestly, does it really matter? You know, you could have that bunch, you could have that bunch. Okay, it'll taste more parsley-like, but essentially it's still going to be fine. Sage, completely different matter. I mean, sage is a fierce, punchy, you know, herb, and it doesn't take prisoners. And you don't want to be telling people to take a bunch of sage because, frankly, the dish is going to be inedible. And again, pepper. Plenty of pepper. It's just going to be a bit more peppery. It's probably going to be fine. And you can say, I like pepper, so I often, you know, probably add more than you might want to. But salt, totally different game. Too much salt, it's inedible. I love salt and I've got low blood pressure, so I do use salt, but I always err on the side of caution on the basis that yes, you can add it, and yes, I do know it's better if it's in the mix, in the pan, whatever, because it subtly changes, whereas sprinkled on it's an obvious, you know, condiment. But I do think, sorry, Landy, you want to say something?
On the salt thing, which I think we all probably agree that salt is better added as you cook rather than walloped on at the end when it just sits on top and tastes like salt afterwards. But I decided in my book that there was no need to measure the salt unless it was something that you couldn't taste. So where possible, I say taste for the salt. But if it's something raw and which will kill you by tasting it, you know, no one wants to taste a lump of raw pork to see whether it's got enough salt in it. So in that case, I did measure it. So I got my own way round that. But Ruth, I completely agree with you in everything. They were only trying to get people to make the recipe successfully, whoever we have eyed up as our potential audience. And we're going to have people who fail. We're going to have people for whom that recipe is too easy or not what they were looking for. But if we get across to them what we would like them to do to get roughly the same result as we have, we've done our job.
Yeah, absolutely. And chilies is another one. I mean, anybody worth their salt will say, you know, start with one chili and then add as you know, add more if you want it. I mean, there's a particularly wonderful Thai dressing in Simon Hopkinson's book, which I borrowed for Fat Girl Slim with credit. And, you know, he says 3 chilies, whatever. Well, I'm not very good with heat, so I'd never use that amount. And you can always add more, but, you know, you can't take them out again. On a very practical note, the nuts and bolts note, Orlando's referred to it, but really, really, really always write as you go along. I think paper and pencil are pen, fantastic in the kitchen. I love my IT and everything else, but there's nothing better than being able to do it. So as you go along, put down immediately what it is you use, because I know I've got a terrible memory, but you will forget. You will just forget. I mean, I posted on the Instagram challenge cress belly with spinach and ricotta, and I'd completely forgotten that in order to lift what's essentially incredibly bland dish, I'd actually added some capers and some chilies and some fennel seeds, and I completely forgot because, you know, it passed me by. I wasn't doing a recipe test, so it didn't matter. But you know, write it down the instant you do it because you won't remember otherwise. Really important to make it clear at the outset to what stage things can be cooked or prepped. This is not for suppers for 2 or what have you, because normally you're just going to go shumph and you're finished and it's all done. But for anything else where you're saying to somebody, this is for a Sunday lunch or a family party or whatever it is, let people know where you can take the recipe to and where it will be really happy to sit and wait so that you only need to do something at the last minute. Don't tell them, you know, this is fine to do, and then they're in the kitchen locked in there having a horrible time, getting hot and steamy and, you know, greasy and foul because you've made them have to do something vital at the end for a large number of people. I mean, that's just unkind. So always tell them where you can stop and how easy it is to stop there and what you do to then rechauffe it or carry on at the very last minute. The method, order method, again, this came up in Sam's questionnaire, excuse me. Even one of my absolutely favorite, well, he's not my favorite cookery writer, but he's certainly one of my favorite people and he writes fabulously well and I love his recipes. But I was doing one of his the other day and I was really annoyed that I had been asked to do a job which took 10 minutes. And then when I got to the next stage, it was onions that needed frying for 40 minutes, 30 to 40 minutes in order to soften and caramelize. And I thought, why didn't you tell me that at the front of the recipe? That could have all been going on while I was doing the 10 10-minute job. So please always look at that order. What takes longest, put it at the front if it can be at the front, and let that be going on while somebody else does something, you know, different. If it's a tricky dish, I think it's really important to say if it goes wrong and what to look out for. Again, I think there's a fine line between being so pessimistic, perhaps is the word, that people think, I'm not going to try that because that looks really dangerous. But equally, if there is an obvious thing where something could go wrong and you know how to say what to look for, then I think it's really quite handy to tell people that, again, on the assumption that they're not a very experienced cook, or even if they are. But I think, you know, signs along the way about what constitutes brown and, you know, what constitutes burnt and all that sort of thing, without going into massive detail, I think it's really important. For example, jam in a French, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm just going to mute myself again, so sorry.
Poor Ruth.
I have the worst sinus problems. My headache yesterday, I cannot tell you, right through my eyeball, it was awful. Anyway, jam in a frangipane tart. So you've got your baked blind thing, you're putting your jam layer in. Too much and it all bubbles out and you've ruined the tart. Too little, you won't see or taste it. That's a really important thing to try and explain to people, just how thick or thin that layer should be in order to work. Chocolate brownies, classic. I mean, I was watching was it probably the Great Bake Off? I couldn't believe how many people overcooked their brownies because they were too unsure. This was the last season as well. And you'd think they'd know by now, too unsure to take it out, you know, so to keep that lovely, soft, moussey sort of texture. So I think things like that. And obviously that's my timer, so I'm overrunning too. Things like that. Obviously, if you've got photographs throughout a book, then it's really helpful as well. But sometimes, you know, the publishers won't pay for that. So if you can help them to understand, that's all good. Distinctive voice, tone and vocabulary. It's like an actor. To some extent, you'll either have a recognizable style or you won't. And I think, you know, it's no point trying to make people be something they can't be. But I think you can definitely avoid some things. And I think over matey expressions are not good. I noticed very recently that Jamie Oliver on my Instagram feed, the word now for a hint or a little trick or a little shortcut is hack. Now, I don't mind Jamie using hack because Jamie's used all sorts of language and it's part and parcel of Jamie's thing. But Prue Leith picked up on it in the oldie. And I just thought, no, it doesn't sit well. I don't care how many brightly coloured necklaces you wear. I don't want you to use the word hack. You know, use hint or something that would be normal and natural to you. She's obviously consorting with a lot of very young people at the moment. But the things about popping something in the oven, I mean, it just, no, don't pop it in the oven. Please don't pop it in the oven. You know, the glagging and the smashing and all that. Unless it is you and it is your style and you are a hipster, then try to just use normal words. So, you know, put something in the oven. Don't place it in the oven. Nobody places anything.
I hate placing things. Unless you are placing it. If you have got to place something, that is, ooh. It's not like boom, is it? Placing.
Yeah, no, awful. So sort of normal language, I think, is the way to go on that. But do try to avoid cliches as well. Now, I'm proud of two things in my life in terms of being a cookery writer. One of them is that I have never had a single person, and you're probably all going to now tell me that, you know, I'm going to be disabused, but I've never once had anybody say a recipe doesn't work of mine. Now, first of all, I have to give huge credit to Sainsbury's Magazine and the amazingly brilliant team of editors and sub-editors and testers and what have you, who made sure that you never went into print with anything that was wrong. But even in my books where, in fact, I did pay for my own testing because I really wanted to keep that record up, it's really important to sorry, so I'm going on a bit. So that's one thing I'm proud of. The other thing I'm proud of is I have never written the word delicious in my life in a professional context. It's such a meaningless, stupid kind of word. I mean, you know, delicious, yeah, fine, but be more explicit. You know, what way is it? you know, citrusy? Is it, I don't know. Try and find a better word. If you find yourself writing something tasty or crispy or any of those things, just stop and say, is there another word I can use that would be better? Not just because I'm avoiding the cliche, but also because I'm actually explaining something in a more accurate fashion than just that catch-all kind of word like tasty. Also, exclamation marks. I allow myself one per book. I use them in emails a lot because you have to be more jokey in emails so that people know you're not being horrible. But I think exclamation marks really shouldn't be necessary. And repetition. I've got one here from a recipe. This leek and salsify gratin recipe is perfect for when you want something warm and comforting on a cold night. Well, that's the biggest cliche for a start, that whole sentence. The cheesy sauce and silky leeks are perfect partners for the beautiful flavor of the cauliflower. So you've got two perfects and you've got two leeks in a 3-line paragraph. Don't do it. Read it through and stop. My final thing, and I've got to try something here which could be tricky, but I'm going to try and share something with you, which is a recipe, and I don't know whether this is going to work or not if I put it in.
This is the Jeopardy moment.
This is the Jeopardy moment, and if it doesn't work, then am I putting it in the desktop? No. Does anyone know where I put it? No. Okay, I don't know why I can't share it, but that's because I'm not very good at it.
If you've got the document open on
I've got it JPEG.
and you should be able to click on that's the main document. You should be able to click on share screen at the bottom of.
Yes, that's what I was trying to do. So there it is. Okay, so share that.
Ruth, it's there.
Very good.
Thank you, Sam. So, okay, this recipe, I'm not going to offend anybody by this. This was in an Italian magazine thingy. So I just want you to see how not to write a recipe. So look at it. Number 1, sultanas are in the ingredients. In the method, if you look down, it's raisins. Prepare the oil. What does that mean? Prepare the oil? What am I going to do? Go out and crush olives? I mean, I don't understand that at all. Put the rains in the white, oh, sorry, that's my misspelling, I think. In the white wine. That's the raisin, the white wine. There isn't any wine in the recipe, there's only vinegar. Onions. How can browned onions be transparent? There's no temperature or timing for the onions, which should be cooked until transparent. And onions will take 25 to 30 minutes. So why aren't they frying them while one's prepping the sardines? Handful of flour in the ingredients should be up by the sardines because that's where you're frying them. Instruction to add part of the pine nuts and the raisins drained and dried. Well, the pine nuts aren't soaked. They should be toasted. So, you know, why are they going in with the raisins, which are drained and dried? And then pour over the vinegar sauce. There's no instruction to drain off the vinegar from the onions. And anyway, it's not a sauce. So that is a really, really bad recipe. You know, I'm making a big thing of that. But it's an example of where not to go. I'm taking it off now because you've seen it. So that's me done. And I think we've said all we need to say.
Thank you, Ruth. Fascinating. I learned so much.
Thank you very much. We have a number of questions.
Do you want to, because of the time, do you want us to answer them very quickly, or how do you want to handle this?
I have been making a note. I apologise. Hopefully I haven't forgotten anyone. There's one just popped in from Frida, which I'm just making a note on, which I will go back to the beginning.
I think we can continue on the Facebook forum later if people have things. Yes. Or indeed, people, if I've said anything annoying, email me and I'll answer you.
Just to say that what I will do is I will download the chat as well, and when we email Orlando's wonderful notes, I'll email that across to you as well. It's quite intense, as all I will say. It's just the format it comes through, but you will have that if you want to refer back to it, because I know a couple of us have posted links to various things like apps and whatnot that have been mentioned in the chat. So yes, the first question was from Amy Bates. So what I'll do is if I mention your name, if you unmute yourself, I'll let you ask your own question. Amy's question was regarding being paid for recipe testing.
Thank you both. It was a brilliant talk. When I wrote my cookery books, which is a long time ago now, the publishers wouldn't pay for recipe testing, and I had to pay for the recipe testing myself, and I actually did it, and then I also got somebody else to do it. Do publishers do that now? Do they pay for recipe testing? And as a guild, if they're not, is this something that we could do something about?
I think, Ruth, my knowledge is that people are not, then we're not paid. It's part of the fee of writing a book, is that you test your recipes and you're expected to do it. I think very, very occasionally the agents manage to get extra money. So I think we do have to, I'm afraid, stump up for it ourselves out of the fee. I mean, it's a good reason to that we deserve the best advance we can get.
When I mean, that's exactly what happened with me, but I was really, and Ruth saying about, she's had a fantastic record of people of never having a recipe go wrong when she's written a book. The problem is the publishers they're asking you to write a cookery book, yet the most important thing, which is get the recipes right, they sort of think that that's just part of it, which I know it's part of it, but it's a really important part that you then have to. Your 1600.
I completely agree. And they just assume that's going to be fun, and they're not really very interested once they've commissioned the book. I mean, as I say, I've always paid to have. Obviously, I test it myself once or twice, 3 times, but I've always paid an external person to test as well, and that has come out of my fee. But then I was writing at a time when you got paid advances and fees, so it wasn't too much of a hardship. But and it is something perhaps we should be looking at as the guild. I don't know, but my biggest problem was I absolutely insisted that I proofread all my books once, twice, 3 times, whatever, because sometimes the subs will introduce a mistake. I remember very vividly the Desiccated, where on one of my books, where the copy editor changed the correct spelling to the incorrect spelling, which made me very cross. But also, because of cut and paste, there's always a danger a line can fall off or do whatever. So I think it's really important that you have the final check of your book or whatever it is to make sure that they haven't introduced a mistake that wasn't there before.
I think, Amy, another approach to this, because we will think about how we might get publishers to at least respect the expense of testing, would be that if you have a reputation as being a reliable professional recipe writer whose recipes always work, that should really be reflected in the fee. And if you're being offered a fee that doesn't cover testing or looks as if you're not going to leave much money left for you, they might as well know that, even if you can't get any more money out of them, because otherwise they won't know it. But it all comes down to having recipes that work. I'm afraid my priority would always be having recipes that work, even if it means that I don't end up with any money in my pocket at all.
And there was a question Bruce asked, actually.
Thank you.
Regarding the skill sets of the people testing the recipes. Do you get people to test them that are of various skills? Obviously, we're all competent cooks because we're food writers. Do you get perhaps a novice cook to try a recipe?
I personally used to use my niece's mother-in-law, who was a very good home cook, but not a professional cook, but neither was she an absolute rank amateur either. And I found that worked really well. When I had to, on one occasion, she wasn't well, I had to use one of our kitchen team to do it. And it was very unsatisfactory, because what he was doing was improving or changing or making it better, but without telling me what he'd done. So I would say to him, but are you sure did you do it like that? And then I'd find out he hadn't done it like that. So actually I wasted a whole stack of money, because then I had it tested again somewhere else, because he was too competent.
I couldn't afford to get my recipes all tested again. My money all went on me testing them, with a few difficult ones by my neighbour Amy, who I would call a good, highly intelligent home cook. Yeah, highly intelligent is probably more useful than the cooking skills, actually, because they know that what to flag up in a recipe that doesn't work for them.
Exactly.
But I don't know how many people can afford, out of today's book advances, to get a whole book of recipes tested again by a member of the by an external person. I don't see that the advances can cover that.
Bruce, did that answer your question? Lyndon, you had an interesting question regarding commission.
Lyndon Wood.
We won't mention the carpaccio this time. But no, photography, I think, I noticed it yesterday with pancakes. It's American stacks of pancakes. Now, my traditional pancake, my childhood would have been a crepe, on Pancake Day. But everywhere, all the newspapers, in so many pictures of stacks of American pancakes, because they're more photogenic, really, than a flat one. So I'm thinking, are we being ruled by photography? People at magazines now are telling you to get library pictures and write a recipe around it. So I wonder how photography is changing what we're eating.
Well, I mean, a good publisher will photograph your recipes as written, and the writer needs to keep a very careful eye from the outset of what the photographer and food stylists are up to. I don't think they deliberately, I don't think they change recipes. Also, we're grateful very often for having made them look beautiful. I mean, my reference pictures, some of them you wouldn't want to eat, but they're lovely dishes, and they will come out, they'll come out lovely in the book. So I think it's a two-way thing. That there is probably a lot of abuse happening there, Lyndon, but if you're working with a publisher, just make sure you're involved on the photography as much as possible so that it doesn't drift away.
But Orlando, I must admit, I have been, over the years, I did start to edit, given that one normally has more recipes than you need to put in a book, I did start to take out ones that I knew couldn't photograph very well. I mean, risotto is a nightmare to photograph. Yeah. Anything flat. And as you said about the pancakes, and the interesting thing about that is obviously if you can roll the pancakes and stuff them or do whatever, or crêpe Suzette, then it's not so bad. But can I just say completely spuriously, I hate stacked pancakes. I used to do one thing with layers of what have you. I just think they're stodgy and horrible. I really don't like stacked pancakes. I like the crepe, as you said. So, but I think one has to just bear in mind how will it photograph, and if you can see that it's a sea of brown, flat nothingness or whatever, then personally I would just take that out and put something else in.
I think it's a very good discipline taking this reference photograph, because if nothing else, it flags up to you that you might need something else, something to jolly that one along.
Yeah, I just think it's sort of almost making it, because of all the newspaper coverage there, for Pancake Day, it's making it the norm that you see this American style stack. So to a lot of sort of the not professional cooks, they're sitting there thinking this is the normal way that pancakes are. And I wonder if it's sort of changing, not so much through books, but through magazines and newspapers.
I think you're just talking about fashion, frankly. Yeah. And there are fashions, they come, they go, they stay, whatever. And I think you just have to live through it and, hope that sense prevails at some stage.
And I think that the Instagram, the overhead shot with everything shot directly overhead, I think that's going to scream 2019 at some point. And we'll start coming round and looking at it from different angles. It's very easy, terribly easy. You can see why people do it. But I think the Instagram, the above shot is going to date myself very badly.
Christy had a question regarding foreign recipes or foreign language titles for recipes. Christy, do you want to elaborate on that? And I know, Carolyn, you had a similar question. So, Christy, you still with us?
Yes, I am. Hi.
Lovely.
I'll try and be a bit more concise in saying this verbally, because my question was a mess when I wrote it. I know with a lot of recipes that aren't English ones, people broadly kind of would understand immediately what a pad thai was or a bouillabaisse or something like that. But with German recipes, which is what I write, the titles largely going to be incomprehensible to people, and they sort of fall into two camps. Either they're just a description of exactly what the dish is, beef with horseradish sauce, for example, a slow cooked beef, or it's something that is has a name that's really not straightforward to know what it is. So, for example, a dish that's called, which translates as heaven and earth. And it's actually blood sausage with mashed potatoes and apple sauce. So of course, you ought to be consistent about it. So would you, for example, in a book or whatever, would you consistently go with having the German title, whether it's interesting or just descriptive, and then translating it underneath as a sort of subtitle in English? Or would you always just go with an English title and then describing the dish and perhaps referring to the name, the German name in the introduction?
Well, heaven and earth is something I've heard of. So in that instance, I would probably use it and then explain in my introduction, where it derives and what it's all about. But I honestly, I think it's exactly what you said right at the beginning. If it's bouillabaisse or something that people will have a pretty good inkling about what to expect, I would just leave it as it is. But if it was something completely opaque, then I think I would probably translate it into English and then explain in the introduction why and how, we came about.
If you're doing a whole book, Christy, I think you need to be consistent within the book. Say you are doing a book or booklet of German recipes, I think you would need to decide whether you're going to put the German at the top with the translation, or translate it and then put the German somewhere else. And I think it'd be up to you what you decided to do, but I would expect you in a book to be consistent in your approach to German or English titles.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Jenny had a question, Jenny Ridgewell, regarding the use of metric and imperial, which also relates to questions that were raised about conversion charts. So yeah, Jenny, do you want to, because it's to do with some research you're doing at the moment.
Yeah, I'm writing about my 1970s teaching. I had to, from 1971, that's 50 years ago, I had to teach in metric in schools. Have any of you got any metric stories about how you convert your recipe?
I've got a story. It goes back to Sainsbury's magazine and Delia again. She didn't like metric. She really didn't like metric. So we spent a long time even persuading her to have imperial with metric in brackets. And over the years, she sort of gave in about it. And nowadays, obviously, I think most books are written in metric, and imperial tends to have been left behind. I mean, we are the only country, as far as I know, in the entire world that has two systems of measurement. And it is extraordinary that we have two systems and that we still have a pint of beer, not a half litre, and all this stuff. I mean, it's just madness. It really is. And I'm of an age where I actually feel absolutely as comfortable with both, because I've had to learn the metric along the way. And if somebody says 30 centimetres, I mean, it's a foot and I can visualize it. But I can see that for younger people who've only been taught metric, then imperial would be something out of Victorian times. And equally, somebody very elderly who's never come across metric will, flail around as well. So I just think we have to knuckle down and realize that we're a very weird nation. But personally, I would still put metric with probably the imperial in brackets or a side or a dash or whatever, personally.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's something soft and cuddly about imperial, and I lived through them both, but I use metric and I'm quite happy with metric, and I'm quite happy with cuts because that's what American cooks use. So I want American cooks to use my recipes. I know it's an imperfect system, but the world is slightly imperfect, and if we rip it weird in England, they're even weirder in America, aren't they? One thing I will just say is that when I encounter a baking recipe with 110 grams or 230 grams, it screams to me this is a rip-off from an American recipe or an old British one. If you can't be bothered to work it out again, sticking with 100, I hate to say it, but Nigella, her baking book is crammed with 110 grams. Who would think of using 110 grams if they weren't converting from a 4-ounce or an American recipe? Anyway, I've had my rant for that.
I actually, funny enough, I cook in metric most of the time, and certainly if I'm doing something myself from scratch. But my pastry recipe, which I've done for 50 years or whatever, I can only do that in imperial. I mean, it's, you know, I weigh the flour. Fortunately, my scales have got a little, you know, it goes from grams to ounces. I know entirely what it is in metric, but I still feel much more comfortable with doing it in imperial.
I do exactly the same. I make my pastry in imperial, but I don't expect other people to. I use grams I think grams and the normality in books.
Yeah.
Somebody
asked in the discussion whether the guild used to have a conversion chart. Do we still have that available? Is it available on the website, Jonathan?
I think we find that I think publishers have their own conversion charts, and it was always a minefield, this, because originally when the conversions were done, I remember this years ago, when the original conversion charts penalised imperial enormously. So it was 100 grams of this, 3 3/4 ounces it was converted to. So you look down the imperial and it was absolutely insanity. It was death by tiny little weights, really. Whereas those need to be worked out sympathetically towards each other. Yeah, so no, we don't have a conversion chart, official conversion chart.
I mean, Orlando, you know, you start with the number one problem: 25 grams or 30 grams for an ounce. You know, I mean, nobody's ever resolved that one at all. And I think you're right, is that the best way would be to test all your recipes in metric, if that's how they're going to be published, and make sensible metric decisions, you know, not based on how they used to be or you know, a translation of something.
Yeah.
I've just put the link to the metrication charts on the Guild website in the chat.
Oh, thank you, Jonathan. Is that the one from many years ago where it's
one from many years ago? Yep. It's the one that was drafted years ago, and we did it in cahoots with BBC Good Food, I think.
Yeah, and Nigel Slater and I fell out about it so badly that we never spoke again. Just so you know.
So I'm Frida, I'm going to bunch your two questions together. One was regarding about salt to taste. Is that a yes or a no from people? And the other was about the translucency of onions. I don't know, Frida, whether you want to go into that further, if you're still with us, Frida.
Hi everyone. Yes, I'm still here. I was about to jump off, but I'm still here. I think it was when Ruth mentioned in that how not to write recipes. It says cook the onions until they are transparent. So I thought, and I was wondering, oh, have I used that, or is it translucent? What do onions look like when they are cooked? Do they get translucent or transparent or not at all?
Interesting. So this whole thing about onions, I mean, you could write a whole book. Well, Lindsay has written a whole book about onions, but in how to cook onions, I think what I was trying to say was that there are too many recipes that say cook until caramelized and then give you 10 to 15 minutes, and you can't. I mean, you have to cook them very slowly. You have to watch them go from being opaque white to being what I would call translucent, possibly transparent, but obviously with that sheen on them, where they're softened and they've wilted and they've sagged and they look, you know, sort of soft and silky. Then you keep going until you get to when they're brown, and that takes a very, very long time. So I think really all I was trying to say was that if you want onions just cooked for, I mean, I remember the Wimpy bar, which you know, it's 40 years before you were born even. But they used to have this huge, great griddle, and they would fry the onions really quickly. So they were sort of brown and sort of raw and sort of disgusting, but actually worked fantastically well in a Wimpy bun. They were burgers, Wimpy, sorry, but terrible burgers. I mean, awful burgers. But you know, in my age, that was all you had. So I think it's just really important to, as we were saying earlier, to be honest, to be accurate, and to make sure that the times given for how you want the state of the onion to be are accurately described. That's really all I'm saying.
Thank you so much, and I'm really glad to hear about onions. Yes,
the onion cooking also depends on you know, what state they're, if they're sliced or if they're chopped or if they're chopped finely.
Yeah.
I decided for the purposes of my book, and again consistently, that I would do it this long to get transparent, I would do it this long to get lightly gold. If I wanted some different effect, I would explain. So it's really deciding what you want and making sure that the reader understands it. And there's that funny, you get that funny smell outside, it's outside football grounds. Ruth, you get that smell of charred onions on the outside, but we're on the inside.
Yeah.
It's to your clothes.
The whole thing.
Casey, are you still with us? You had a question regarding plagiarism.
Yeah, I'm still here. So what can you do if you suspect somebody may have used your recipe and simply reworded it or tweaked one or two ingredients, for example?
I complain. I have complained. There was a woman, totally innocently, I wasn't angry about it, but she'd entered some kind of competition, and it was my recipe, word for word, that she, you know, won this competition. And I thought, you can't do that, because the whole point about the competition was it was a domestic cook, you know, coming up with some idea. So I actually wrote or emailed, I can't remember, to the publishers and said, could I just point out that that recipe is in my book, or wherever it was, magazine, you know, blah, 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 and it's word for word. And I got an apology about it. I think it's really, you have to, though, really, really be honest with yourself, because there are so many, I mean, you know, a trifle, so many classic recipes where you can put a spin on it, and you know, they've all evolved. There is no such thing really. I suppose Otto Lengi is probably one of the few people who has invented a sort of style of cooking, a way of putting things together. And before him, perhaps Peter, the Sugar Club, fusion food, that was a genuine new thing. But I think on the whole, most things have evolved. And unless, you know, when I read something, I think that sounds suspiciously like mine. And then I think, well, actually, is it really because, you know, the nuts and bolts of it were back in the eons of time, and perhaps I've evolved it along the way and they haven't exactly used my language, although sometimes there's a stray sentence where you think that's word for word what I said. I don't bother then. But if it's a real upload, you know, take off thing, Orlando.
Yeah, Casey, I'd like to turn your question right around, and more interesting to me, particularly for the purpose of this discussion, is how we avoid ever having anyone tell us that we've taken their recipe, which means you have to be honest with yourself. Have I just changed the wording of this and passed it off as my own? Or have I just changed the sage to rosemary and I'm just passing it off as my own? So that you never want to be in a position of having anyone say to you that you've taken their recipe, because if that's all you've done, you shouldn't really be publishing it. There's no point. You could almost say, instead of putting that recipe, you should say, see page 38 of this book for this dish, because you know, that's where you'll find it perfectly. With regard to plagiarism, if you ever actually find an example of plagiarism which you want to tackle professionally, then Sarah Beattie, who looks after professional issues, has lots of experience of this. When it's a bad thing, like for instance, an American publisher nicks your whole book and publishes it with a new title, which has happened, I believe.
Carolyn Boyd, you had a question regarding writing, sort of including ingredients in the list in the method.
Yes, because sometimes I just have to write it sort of in running copy. It's perhaps not a very complicated recipe, more something simple, but would you do that? Sort of take one apple, add 125 grams, blend, so you combine the ingredients with the method, and what would the pitfalls be with doing it that way?
I think again, Orlando's referred to being consistent. So I think if your style is going to be in the ingredients list, 1 onion, comma, finely chopped, and you keep doing that throughout the whole book or whatever, then I think that's fine. That's your style and it works. I find that sometimes one falls over on that. I did a recipe recently because I've been writing down things I've been cooking in lockdown, and for myself and possibly a future book, I don't know, probably not. But I came across something where I thought, actually, that's not very helpful because I can't write it succinctly in the ingredients list. It really does need to be in the method. And so I suppose I wasn't consistent because I left the finely chopped and the chopped and things up there in the ingredients. And then on one ingredient, I said, but I did put it at the beginning. And I think that's another way to possibly handle it, is to say, you know, I haven't explained this in the ingredients list, but, you know, you need to do this first, whatever it is you need to do with it, you know? I don't know, Orlando might disagree.
No, I agree. I mean, there are times when you're writing the whole recipe and running copy, which is fine. That's not ideal, but if it's a short, simple recipe, then that's absolutely fine. Otherwise, I think it's what is most helpful for the reader. Are they going to finely chop the onion before they start, or should they be doing that while the recipe is in progress? And if it's while the recipe is in progress, because there's a whole load of chopping that you can do together with the same knife and the same board, then you can help them out here. So it's just, that's our old friend common sense coming in there. But so I don't have a consistent style for that. Sometimes I deliberately want them to do it as part of the method. Sometimes I want them to do it up in the ingredients list.
And if I can just add into this, because it came up both in Sam's Twitter questionnaire and also somewhere else, I think on our forum, Nigel in Tender, first time he'd ever done it was he wrote the ingredients, so sort of, let's just, for sake of argument, onion, carrots, leeks or whatever, and then afterwards put onion -1, leeks -2, carrots -4 or whatever it was. And I found it really, really disconcerting, and I didn't like it at all. Now, somebody else just said that in fact their mother loved it that way round and really enjoyed it, and I found it kind of so self-conscious that to me it was trying to be a point of difference, and I just didn't kind of buy into it. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe people would prefer it to come afterwards, the quantity.
Yeah, I did a recipe. I think in my book I've got one recipe where I say you don't need your scales for this one, and it's all done by using the empty tin. And it's just that recipe happens to work that way. And I remember once we had a very curious recipe in the magazine where someone had made, a reader had made cinnamon rolls, very, very complicated thing to make. You know, they're wound up with things like Chelsea buns, and they'd used partly imperial and partly metric, but everything was a lovely round number. And we've all got scared, everything, it worked beautifully. And once you started to make it all uniform, it was very kind of, the numbers went all weird. So we left it and we said, this is a reader recipe and they do it like this and you'll enjoy doing it, believe us. Yeah. And it was a lovely recipe, absolutely lovely.
Aggie had a question regarding, I'm trying to find it because she sent it to me directly, and she doesn't appear to be, she's not on her screen. So if you're there, Aggie, and you're listening, can you, oh, she's back. Aggie, I'm handing over to you. Can you ask your question regarding the listing of ingredients? It's kind of related to Carolyn's nicely. You need to unmute yourself, love. We can't hear you. There you go.
So if you have a recipe with 3 lots of processes, say it's sort of rabbit and mustard sauce with roasted kohlrabi. And so you've got lots of things going on. Now, so the rabbit's the star ingredient, but you have to roast your kohlrabi first. So you've got your 3 different processes. Do you list the rabbit first in the method or the kohlrabi, because you start to work with the kohlrabi first, but it's not the star? See what I mean?
Well, Aggie, as one of the best sub-editors in the entire world, I'm not quite sure why you're asking this question. Aggie was marvellous when I wrote for Sainsbury's Magazine, absolutely brilliant, and went home and cooked everything. And your sons are both chefs, aren't they? Yeah. Now, you see, this is an interesting one.
Actually, it's my son's question.
Okay, so while the title, I think, should definitely be Rabbit Mustard Sauce Kohlrabi, I definitely would put the kohlrabi first, because this is this thing I was saying about the lovely person whose recipes I love or what have you, who once I spent 15 minutes finished filleting the fish. I know you should read a recipe through the whole way before you start. I never do. I'm very naughty. But I was then really irritated that my onions could have been cooking away while I was doing, because then I had to wait, you know, to doing nothing. So I would definitely put the kohlrabi first personally, if that needed roasting for 45 minutes or whatever, and the rabbit only needed 20 minutes at the end. That would be me, but Orlando might be different.
I completely agree, because by the time you've got to you've given them the recipe, the name of the recipe, which is rabbit with blah, blah, blah. You've given them an introduction. Then you're talking about structuring the work. And it's very unhelpful to find it that you needed to start the kohlrabi, but you started with the rabbit, because most people do start at the top. It's the natural thing to do.
Yeah, I guess it's like the ingredients list though. That's
No, I would. I'd put the kohlrabi before the rabbit, definitely.
Got you.
I would always,
I would.
if you go back, as I'm sure you have, and you look at recipe books from, you know, before the 70s or whatever, or 60s and things, it's extraordinary how many of them, the ingredients are just completely random. I mean, totally random. And we're so used now to going dum dum dum. I can't bear it if it's not the ingredients must mirror the method to me, always.
It's part of today's recipe writing skills. We've come a long way since Mrs. Beaton, and this is how it's done now. And this is state-of-the-art recipe writing that we should all be doing. And apart from the things that we've been talking about, having things in the right order is where it all starts.
Yeah. So I'm just looking at.
Oh yeah, thank you.
And actually, you've probably changed things, but say for instance, one salmon salad niçoise. To serve two, you've got the potatoes, the beans, and then underneath for the dressing and the ingredients for the dressing. So then you start in the method to make the dressing. So you see what I mean? So you've got the hero first, well, the potatoes and the beans and the eggs and the salmon in the ingredients list, and then you have that little section about the dressing. Down below.
Again, I think that was my first cookbook, and I might do things differently, but I don't have a problem. In fact, I like it and whether it's Diana Henry or Nigel, I don't care who it is. Yeah. I actually like it when it is separated out, the foods from the sauce or the dressing or whatever. I like that because first of all, I never cooked Ottolenghi back when he first started. I loved his food because I just looked at that long list. Can't be bothered. I was talking to somebody fairly recently. All my cooking, every evening, in the summer, our main meal might be at lunchtime when we're sitting outside, but in the winter, it's in the evening. And all my cooking, I go and do my prep like a restaurant chef at about 4 or 5 o'clock or whatever, get everything set up. And then I absolutely refuse to spend more than 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes actually cooking. I mean, that's it. No way. Different if you're going to make a wedding cake or whatever. So for me, having an interminable list is horrible. And having it broken up into this is the dressing, this is the thing, that works for my brain very well. Yeah.
I do like the ingredients divided into units. I think that's really helpful for people. It just helps them to understand.
Like a Christmas cake, for example, you want the cake, you want the almond paste, you want the icing. Yeah. I don't want them all in one long list. No.
There is one last question, I think, because we ought to probably start winding up, because someone has mentioned lunch. My tummy's certainly rumbling. And that's from Ruth about in terms of listing the ingredients. Ruth, I don't know whether you want to. Are you still with us?
Yes, I am actually. First of all, thank you. It's been really, really brilliant talk and very, very helpful and useful. But my question is, in a list of ingredients, would you put 1 onion finely chopped, or would you put 1 onion and put that in the method you need to finely chop the onion?
I find, Ruth, that it depends. If I want if that's a separate process, as part of the setup at the beginning, then I'm very happy to put it finely chopped in the ingredients list. If, however, the chopping of the onion can be integrated with some part of the making, like you chopping things together on the same board, then I would say take an onion.
Okay.
Whatever is most helpful and most streamlined for the reader. And if you make the recipe, if you actually test it a couple of times, you get the hang of how the recipe hangs together in the most helpful way, I think.
I found the recipe that I wrote down that was where I started to put 3 or 4 spring onions, and I would have normally put finely chopped, 2 sticks of inner celery, sliced or chopped, half a normal sized fennel bulb, and then I slowed down and I got to the chicory and I thought, I can't do this in the ingredients list, because what I want to be able to tell them is I want to tell them to unfurl the fennel to make the petal, and then to slice it and then to chop it. And I want to tell them to halve the chicory, cut out the hard white core, and then cut across. So the moment I discovered that I can't put it all in that ingredients list, I then did running copy for all of it.
Right. Right. So it's how you think your recipe flows.
And yeah, absolutely. And I think it's vital. I mean, with the chicory, for example, absolutely, it's for a pasta thing. There's no way you want that hard white core, so that if you had just said slice lengthways, chopped across or whatever, sliced across, they would have ended up with great knobbles of hard white core. And I couldn't have that happening, because that's not how it's meant to be. So the minute I had to explain that they had to do that, then I thought, no, I can't do it in the ingredients list. This is going into running copy.
But should you be consistent with all your recipes to either put in running copy or put in ingredients list? Or does it not matter?
For me, no, I don't need that kind of consistency within the recipe, yes, but if it's something complicated and where something needs to be explained, I don't mind if on that page my ingredients have finely sliced and everything is with the ingredients, and on this page it's running copy. It doesn't bother me one iota, but it might bother Orlando.
No, I completely agree. I think that I think we have a bedrock of consistency, and we have an override of common sense.
Yeah.
So that if we can help the reader more by doing it a different way, like I said about this recipe where you measure using the can of the empty can of tomatoes, we do an override on consistency, and we realize we're doing it, and we're doing it because it makes the recipe better for the person who's making it. And that you're allowed to, you can do what you like. After all, you don't have to be consistent, but I believe one should be consistent because one is professional. But then if you're really there with the reader trying to make their life better, then you can make a decision that on this occasion, I'm going to do something slightly different.
And if I can just add in my method on this one, and again, to help the reader, should there ever be one, I'm warming my largish frying pan over a low medium heat. I'm pouring in a generous swig of olive oil, and I put in brackets, it's not just to cook the veg, but to coat the pasta. And again, I wanted to indicate that it's possibly more than you might normally put in, because it is actually going to perform another function. So again, helping, I hope, helping.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. I think it's probably time to wrap up now. Just to say, Ruth referred a couple of times to a question I posted on Twitter yesterday to domestic cooks about what their biggest bugbears were regarding recipes. I've had, just check, oh gosh, a number, I mean, well over 30 comments from said domestic cooks, some of which I'm sure you will agree with, some you won't. What I will do is I will copy and paste those comments into a document which will circulate with Orlando's. I won't name the individuals. If you want to see that, you'll need to go onto my Twitter account. But just because they are quite interesting, this is obviously from the end user, so to speak. I think you'll find them quite fascinating. I certainly did. I haven't entered into any discussions personally with them. I've just let them feedback and have their views expressed. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Sam, for being such a lovely chairman. Thank you.
I didn't have
and also to Judy for organising it. Is Judy Bastira here somewhere? But anyway, thank you, Judy.
And Ruth and Orlando, thank you very much. If we can give everyone a clap, or you can do your clap button at the bottom. That's wonderful. And I will also forward the chat as well. It does come out and not quite gobbledygook, but it is quite, I'll try and smarten it up so it's a bit easier to read. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone. Thank you, Sam.
That's all right. You're welcome. I'm going to stay on until everyone's gone.
I will say goodbye.
Stay on, Orlando.
Oh, okay.
Such a great mask, it really is. Wonderful. Are we alone yet?
I'm not sure. So I'm just checking I've got the thing, because it saves it.
They've all gone off and made lunch. We've rumbled them. They're all off making lunch.
I know. Well, I had to mute myself because my tummy really is rumbling. It's always talk about transition.
And Orlando, what did I tell you? 2 hours, you see. We've been 2 hours nearly. I knew it.
You know what? We could have, bless her, Casey had a question, but I did say to post it in the Facebook forum because I was conscious of the fact we were getting up to the 2 hour mark. I think we could have gone for another hour probably.
Oh, I think that was enough, really. But that was fascinating. Thank you, Ruth. I learned so much from you.
No, and from you. I enjoyed it. Whether everyone else did, I don't know, but I enjoyed it.
And they were intelligent questions.